it was dominated by neighboring powers, which actually, paradoxically, provided plenty of room for political imagination. So imagining the future form of the Polish state, and also looking for models. And this is where the Japanese model, as a point of reference, this is where the Japanese model comes into play. So let me now say something about the end, and then I will return to the beginning. So I want to talk a little bit about the 80s, and then I am going to return to the beginning of the 20th century. So the idea of building a second Japan in Poland, the slogan, the phrase, was proclaimed by Lech Wałęsa, the leader of the Solidarity movement in 1980. And it was very prominent in the Polish political discourse during that decade of the 1980s. It was never elaborated in much detail, but of course the slogan itself serves as an illustration of the attractiveness of Japan as a model, a social, political, and economic model in Poland in the 20th century. 3 decades later, Wałęsa himself remembered how the slogan was invented spontaneously soon after the large-scale strikes and the creation of Solidarity in August 1980. And Wałęsa remembered, I quote, "Even though I had never been to Japan, I said, we are going to build a second Japan in Poland. In this short slogan, we said clearly that we wanted freedom. We were going to build a new system, but it was expressed diplomatically with no incitement. Using that metaphor was meant to showcase our philosophy of the struggle, the philosophy of the shipyard workers, the miners, and all the people of the opposition, a wise, peaceful struggle." End of quote. So it is, of course, remarkable that the country that used to be an aggressor during World War II came to be seen as a symbol of peaceful struggle by the leader of the anti-totalitarian human rights movement in Poland. And Wałęsa himself was a Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1983. And apparently to him, Japan symbolized a non-confrontational attitude, a non-violent, gradual, a model of gradual progress towards national independence and economic success. Wałęsa also explained that in 1980, he felt restricted in his public statements. So he was not in a position to name a different country that might have been closer to home. I quote, "I could not have used an example of a state which stood in opposition to the communist bloc. I could not have said we were going to build a second West Germany or France." End of quote. No, actually, he also said, "We needed an example which was distant, a model that was simultaneously politically neutral." End of quote. So Japan, a distant model, here was seen to represent the West rather than the East, in Wałęsa's phrase. Soon after that, Wałęsa actually had a chance to visit Japan himself. And he came to the conclusion his slogan was correct on more levels, including economic, political, and social cultural factors. Again, I quote Lech Wałęsa for the last time here. "I had the chance to visit Japan, and I was confirmed in what I had preached earlier. I saw the Japanese solidness, reliability, hard work. I saw the discipline and efficiency coming out of goodwill, the will to work for the construction of the country and one's own prosperity based on the principles of the democratic system. I saw the good roads, I admired the economy, I observed an efficiently functioning political system rooted in a love for tradition and respect for the monarchy, with a strong element of modernity. That was the kind of reality I wished for Poland. I wanted to live in a country like that." End of quote. And I think that is a brilliant summary of the Polish perception of Japan and the Polish attitudes to Japan as a model. So both countries are seemingly separated by a large physical and cultural distance. But there is another phrase I found, a phrase written by Wiesław Górnicki, another Polish political figure from the 80s and an opponent of Lech Wałęsa. Górnicki was the #1 advisor to General Jaruzelski, who was the dictator of Poland in the 80s. And in this book, Górnicki wrote, for us Poles, Japan is basically a neighboring country. And I thought that was a very clever way to put it. Of course, a key factor in this formulation was both countries' direct neighborhood with Russia. And in fact, Górnicki himself refers directly to the Russian-Japanese war as a reason for this phrase. But on another level, this Polish fascination with Japan really goes beyond the geopolitics vis-a-vis Russia. You know, the idea of combining social modernization with a strong sense of tradition. This is really what was important. And that is in a way summed up in a title of another book about the Japanese model published in 1972. The title of the book was The Challenge of the Enlightened Samurai. And I think the idea of an enlightened samurai really is very strongly embedded in the Polish perspective or perspectives on Japan. Now, you know, jumping back to the first decade of the 20th century, that was the first peak of Polish interest in Japan, and especially around the time of the Russian-Japanese War, as illustrated by many publications in the Polish press, and especially Tygodnik Ilustrowany, which was the most popular newspaper in Poland at the time, that really published a lot of articles about Japan before, during, and after the war. And I have this little treasure here that I also want to show you. That is the original edition from 1905. It is a book by Okakura Kakuzo, The Awakening of Japan. Really interesting to note that it was published in Polish just a few months after the original edition in English appeared, and that of course illustrates there was a market in Poland for such publications. Another really interesting fact that I should mention here is that during the war in 1904, two important Polish leaders, Józef Piłsudski and Roman Dmowski, both traveled to Japan at the same time and promoted their ideas of a Polish-Japanese relationship and also the ideas of Poland's future. So Piłsudski looked for Japanese help in organizing an uprising against Russia in Poland as the leader of the Polish Socialist Party. And he also had an idea to organize a Polish army against Russia in the Far East. In contrast, Dmowski wanted the opposite. He went to Japan to discourage the Japanese government from supporting the ideas of Piłsudski. They were very much rivals. Also in the sense that they represent different versions, different visions of Polish national identity and statehood. that really dominate Polish political imagery well into the 21st century. So Piłsudski sort of symbolizes the idea of civic identity. Dmowski symbolizes as a sort of right-wing version of ethnic nationalism. And guess what? They bumped into each other in a street in Tokyo, as you do, of course. And it is a little known, fascinating fact, in my view, that the only real conversation between them took place in Tokyo in 1904. It lasted 9 hours. They didn't come to an agreement. But you could say that this confrontation of two visions of Poland, it took place in Tokyo, and you could say that the Japanese context informed this really historic meeting, this really important discussion about the future of Poland. And thanks to Professor Haruka Miyazaki from Hokkaido University, I had the chance to visit the restaurant where that conversation took place, and I can tell you that was a very memorable moment for me, coming from Poland. And I would say Dmowski in particular, the right-wing nationalist, was influenced and very much impressed by the Japanese model, and he wrote later several times about Japan in his articles and in his books. And one of the quotes I have is that the sense of duty and absolute sacrifice as a form of patriotism, that is what he took from Japan as an inspiration. But there are also several other important Polish political, cultural, and also religious figures who traveled and lived in Japan and were influenced by that experience very strongly in the first half of the 20th century. And I realize I really don't have enough time to tell you about them in detail, but I will just maybe briefly mention them. One is Bronisław Piłsudski, who was actually Józef Piłsudski's brother, a Polish revolutionary, political prisoner in the Russian Far East, who later became an anthropologist and a researcher of the Ainu culture in Sakhalin, which, as you know, changed hands many times between Russia and Japan in the 19th and the 20th century. He lived with the Ainu. He started a family there, and his interest and activism for the rights of the Ainu took him to Hokkaido and later to Tokyo. A really fascinating figure. This book is very fresh. It is a collection of writings by Bronisław Piłsudski from that period, under the title Japan of the Meiji Period in the Eyes of Bronisław Piłsudski. And just one short sentence from his article from 1909. The times are changing. The old authorities the old certainties are falling down. Japan is entering a new era when the power will be held by the new generation, raised and educated on the ideas of democratic Europe. Well, whether or not that was a correct assessment, we may discuss later. But Bronisław Piłsudski was a really fascinating figure. When he was in Tokyo, he actually spent some time with another Polish revolutionary and former political prisoner, Wacław Sieroszewski, and also a writer. This book here is really rare. published in a small number of copies in the early 80s. But the author actually read and analyzed all of the literary output of Wacław Sieroszewski, and argued that not only 80 to 90% of the pages in his books are devoted to Japan and other cultures in the Far East, but all of the imagery and references in the books, or vast majority, are in fact informed by the Japanese culture and other cultures in the Far East. And he goes as far as saying that Sieroszewski was not really a Polish writer. He wrote in Polish, but he was a Japanese writer writing in Polish, which I thought was a really nice and provocative statement. But you cannot overestimate the importance of Wacław Sieroszewski as a member of the Polish cultural and political establishment in the interwar period, especially the 1920s, 1930s. Another example, Aleksander Jan Topolczyński, one of the founding fathers of Polish journalism, modern Polish journalism, who also lived in Japan in the 1930s in this case, and was very much influenced by that experience, and especially by Japanese Buddhism. And the last example I want to mention briefly, but it's important, is Maximilian Maria Kolbe, who is a household name in Poland, not least as a saint of the Catholic Church, who spent some years in Japan, also in the 30s, as a missionary. So he had an idea to turn Japan into a Catholic state, and he didn't succeed, and he was not the first to try and fail. But that also had an impact on him. He was an anti-Semitic right-wing nationalist, like Roman Dmowski. But you know, he can also be a symbol of the tragedy of the 20th century. Despite being of German origin himself, he was arrested by the Nazis during World War II and sent to Auschwitz, and died in Auschwitz. According to some testimonies of his fellow inmates, in the last weeks and days of his life, he still talked about his experience of Japan and Japanese culture and Japanese customs, which I thought was very symbolic in many ways. So of course, during World War II, Poland and Japan found themselves on the opposing sides of the conflict. But in a way, I would say the experience of World War II, symbolized by Auschwitz, as well as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that is another platform for building empathy and solidarity between Poland and Japan. And as you know, the motto "Never Again" is close to my heart, and I think I can say it without trivializing or underestimating the difficulties in dealing with the past in different ways in the history of both nations. But now I'm really finishing. Thank you for your tolerance. I would like to say that, you know, the examples I gave here and some others that I did not mention, of course, they tend to tell us much more about Poland than about Japan. And those diverse Polish perspectives on the so-called Japanese model, they in a way provide a mirror in which different visions of Polish identity are reflected and played out. And I would not criticize that too harshly. I think that mechanism in a way seems quite normal. So not many Poles had a chance to visit Japan, like Lech Wałęsa, but in the eyes of many Poles, it was Japan that became a symbol of their own collective aspirations related to modernity on the one hand and national traditions on the other hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rafal, for that absolutely fantastic, very thought-provoking talk. And I especially loved your climactic ending, that really Japan serves as a kind of mirror for the collective aspirations of Polish nationalism. So rather than the objective reality, it's more kind of how it serves as this kind of almost not an empty signifier, but definitely a polyvalent signifier for Polish aspirations. I mean, so similar to India, really, really fascinating. But I'll give my comments later, but I'll just kind of field two comments, thoughts which have just come up. The first one is from Kazuhiro Taki, who writes, Walesa came and visited my university in 1998 at the 100th anniversary of the university. I'm afraid that today's Japan might disappoint Poland. So that's one comment. Do you want to comment something on Rafal, or should I move into the next?
Well, actually, I think that maybe gives me a chance to mention something else. I think if we look at the 20th century, of course, those ideas of modernity and nationalism, they were very much in the focus. I think today, both Poland and Japan are really facing certain parallel challenges, also related to identity, and especially on the level of inclusivity, which is also related to the demographic situation, the issues around migration, etc. And I think in a way both Poland and Japan are facing some similar issues, again very much related to the field of identity.
Absolutely, absolutely, fascinating. Yeah. The next comment is from Daniel Baburek, who writes, very interesting to hear that Japan can be seen as the neighbor of Europe, as the endpoint of the Eurasian subcontinent. It is true, however, anybody who has to flee Europe but cannot go west will end up in Japan. This can be seen in the White Russians fleeing the Bolsheviks to Japan, as well as Jewish persecuted getting Japanese visas to escape to the east.
Well, again, if you allow me to make a quick comment on that, one of the things one of many things I didn't mention is the kind of cooperation that existed between certain Polish and Japanese officials in helping hundreds of Polish Jews during the Holocaust. That's another important and fascinating fascinating story. So despite Poland and Japan were in a state of war, there was actually some cooperation between officials of both states. And actually, there was even some discussion in Poland this year, believe it or not, about whether or not Poland and Japan are still in a state of war, which apparently is not 100% clear, but I think we can declare peace by now.
Thank you so much, Rafal. We don't have any immediate comments. So I guess we could probably go, if it's kind of what Sonia was planning as well, maybe take a 10-minute break and then reconvene with a longer discussion session. So if